Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending the second session of today, Spiritual Modernity. This evening, we present firstly a lecture by Miyu, a curator, researcher, academic on the staff of the Academy of Media Art, Berlin. Secondly, a lecture performance dash by artist Ho Luyan, who is based on Singapore. And finally, the film Forgetting Vietnam by Trinh Thi Minh Ha. Miyu and Ho Luyan will explore two distinguished examples of andro-modernity of Asian region. The one is highly neoliberalized condition found in the current Singapore society, and the other is militarized economic development found in the past high modern, that is early mid-20th century Manchukuo puppet state. According to Okuyeneger, in his article, Modernity and Post-Colonial Ambivalence, andro-modernity means a hybrid form of modernity found especially in countries like China and South Korea, where the development has adopted the Western model of modernization, so-called super-modernity, the sole category of the developed and advanced. And Miyu and Ho Luyan's these two timely distance modernity in their presentation today. So one is early 20th century and then current time, interestingly resonate with each other, questioning how the new experiments of advanced economic system propelled by nation state has been non-stop dubious capital empire in Asia. However, what kind of ambivalence particular to them is still able to be contested in a new light. The lecture by Miyu, titled Slow Silk Road Networks and Denationalistic Imaginaries, will examine the Japanese puppet regime Manchukuo, where seemingly cosmopolitan imperialism or transnational principle unfolded. For the last several years, Miyu has dedicated her research to the Silk Road, which encompasses as much to the historical review of a trade and cultural transfer as to contemporary geographics in Asia. Her analytical attempt with a deep historical yet post-nationalistic perspective was swept with the medieval decentralized trade networks and late capitalistic networks. Since Manchuria was also the place where the syncretic capitalistic system executed by the Japanese government during the occupation, this Manchukuo model can be seen as a later influence on a post-war economy and politics of Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and eventually China. With a speculative leap, this presentation will investigate the geography of Silk Road and the possibility of the slower Silk Road envisioned by French anarchist geographer Élisée Reclus. More than projecting the human into geographical times, it is a call for letting the geo-movement infuse ourselves, in which a certain aspect of Kyoto School can be revisited as well. Triggered by footage and accident capture from the dash cam, performance dash by Ho Luyan scrutinized how the accident or crisis become legible within a risk-managed and financially hedged era. Of special interest is the logic of horizon scanning that undergirds the foresight of programs of the Singapore government as a crucial node along the electronic circuit of the global finance, as well as a sweaty regional route crossed by this enfranchised migrant labor. Singapore is held up within the lecture as a privileged site to attend to the disturbance or weak signal that crop up on the horizon, from which a fantastic speculative economy is produced to affirm some narrative while extinguishing others. At the last of the today, the film Forgetting Vietnam by Trinh Thi Minh Ha will be screening. Shot in high-8 video in 1995 and in HD and SD in 2012, The images in the film unfold especially as a dialogue between two elements, land and water, both as a myth and a reality that underlie the foundation of Tom country, especially to the Vietnam. Carrying the histories of the both visual technology and Vietnam's political reality, these images are also meant to feature the encounter between the Asian as related to the solid earth and the new as related to the liquid changes in the time of rapid globalization. In the conversation with these two parts is a third space that is a historical and a cultural rememory, or what local inhabitants, migrants, and veterans remember of yesterday's story to comment on today's event. Through the insight of these witnesses to one of America's most divisive war, Vietnam's specter and her contribution to the world history remain both present and too easy to forget. Touching on trauma of an international scale, Forgetting Vietnam is made in a commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the end of the war and of its survivor. But this film was co-produced with the ACC Gwangju. Now we welcome Miu and with her lecture, Slow Silk Road Network and Denationalistic Imaginaries.
So I will have to kidnap everybody for the next half an hour or so and trade the image of the tiger with the image of a vampire. And I hope that I will succeed also in trading that, because they do share similarities and they do belong to the same process of transmogrification. And also, to borrow Yukhui's concept of the passage and the passing. And alternatively to what I will be speaking about, the Kyoto School's idea on this experience that precedes the individual. So we start with the image of the vampire. And as Hyunjin has already introduced, to situate my own work a little bit more, I've been looking at, and I've also been traveling on the Silk Road for the past few years. And it stands for me both as a historical space, a series of trade routes that connected East Asia and Europe, as everybody is aware of, but also as a geopolitical trope of today's supranational, supra-international infrastructural projects. It is as much as a lived reality of all the different peoples, of different cultures and religions, as also what became later known as the name of which Seitenstraße, coined by a German geographer in the 19th century, denoting European imperialism of the time. So my interest in this is not to go back to any romanticized originary state, but to ask, what can we take from this image of the Silk Road to this transgressive potential to once again re-enactivate it. So one way of doing this, for this I've been also engaging with artists from different geographical locations. One method that I've adopted is looking at the Silk Road as a decentralized network, decentralized or distributed in the sense that it had no known center, and that you can sort of you can study the text record actually recovered by archaeologists from various spots along the ancient Silk Road, and really looking at how much, how big the volume of trade actually was back then, and then in sort of reconstructing a network that had always had its own inner organicity, but that didn't necessarily have a center. And then you can ask, what is the image that, for example, the Chinese government is re-invoking today in its economic planning, in its infrastructure project that with railroads and road construction projects that's connecting East Asia and Europe again today. So these are sort of methodological notes. what was a decentralized network in very much very much time in the past came to be confronted with nationalism and nationalist-based border regimes in the 20th century, and this is where I also address geopolitics in different parts of Greater Central Asia and engaging with artists that work with these issues. And still, another strand of research deals with, sort of takes a leap from the old trade route and then looking at today's capitalistic networks. And here we see how the reconfiguration of network takes on new dimensions, where in these labors of different kinds and natural resources on a global scale, and in assuming this more extractive mode. So here I also, quite incidentally, look at the image of the Dark Silk Road, this famous drug dealing website, which also has a decentralized nature to it, and try to look them together. But what I would be doing today is looking at a work called Kishi the Vampire, hence the Vampire, which is a piece that I commissioned last year for also ACC, Asia Cultural Center in Korea, where I curated a series of performances dealing with Silk Road in its different iterations. Kishi the Vampire is a work of Hong Kong-based Australian artist Royce Ng. It's a lecture performance on the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, which lasted from 1932 to 1945, and the invention of East Asian state-guided capitalism. And this all goes to this one person who was the finance minister of Manchukuo back then, by the name of Nobusuke Kishi, portrayed as a vampire. To give a little bit of a historical overview for those who's not in the know, Manchuria, the region that's here, and you see this map that will actually become relevant later, which illustrates the Japanese defense circle in the Second World War. Manchuria is the modern name given to designate the vast area roughly encompassing northeast China today, and it was the homeland of the Manchu nomadic people who overthrew the Chinese Ming dynasty and established Qing in 1644, the last imperial dynasty of China. Qing intentionally kept the vast land unpopulated to keep a buffer zone to Russia, and starting from the 19th century, large influx of Chinese peasants from the inland moved into the area to nurture the fertile virgin land, and Korean peasants too also moved in from the peninsula. Russia's geopolitical interest in the Pacific ports led to the construction of the eastern part of the Trans-Siberia Railway, which goes all the way here to the port of Vladivostok. And after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Japan seized parts of the railway and re-established it under the South Manchuria Railway Company. We have a few brochures from the 30s of the Japanese South Manchurian Railway Company, but that had actually a much larger ambition of not just connecting Northeast Asia, but also, so this will be Northeast Asia, and this is going down south to Taiwan and the Malaya Peninsula and Indonesia. There's an even larger version of this, which, as you see, is the sort of the connection, of the Eurasian connection that looks a bit similar to what we know today under various construction plans between the Chinese, Kazakhstan, and Russian governments. So in The South Manchurian Railway Company, we have to be clear, is such an operation as the British East India Company, and they used it to infiltrate political and economic control into the area. And in 1931, the Japanese Kwantung Army staged a detonation on the rail route near Mukden, Fengtian, or Shenyang today, as an excuse to effectively occupy Manchuria. In 1932, they installed the last Qing dynasty Emperor Puyi as the Emperor of Manchukuo and established Manchukuo as a constitutional monarchy. Though formally independent and with necessary alliance with local Chinese warlords and elites, Manchukuo was run de facto by Japanese technocrats and the military. The narrative Kishi the Vampire takes Nobusuke Kishi, the finance minister of Manchukuo, as the main protagonist. So I will show a 5-minute clip from the lecture performance.
To the Minister of Agriculture and Commerce, you pass beneath a red and blue glow, and weave through the saturnine masses of young boys and girls, crews of theatres and tea houses of Kabuki-cho Dori, being careful not to be tempted by the slit in young waitresses' kimono. In the offices of the Documents and Archives section, Nobusuke Kishi relished the task of breaking up the ministry to promote himself while settling scores and devolving control of the economy to the new bureaucrats. The state's silk and poppy farms had been a tremendous economic resource during the war, when silk prices were booming, and morphine rose from 500 to 1,000 yen per pound. But as the World Depression progressed, the Japanese began to experience an overproduction crisis as international export shrank, domestic consumption slowed. In a proto-Keynesian gesture, the Minister of Finance passed a temporary measure to increase government deficit spending on armaments, but it was not enough. The questions which plagued Kishi and his colleagues were what had caused the recession to last so long, why were the balance of payments in deficit, why were corporate profits so low, and what could be done. The problems of the Japanese economy were continuous, and the newly formed Ministry of Industry and Commerce sent Kishi to America, where planning departments could do the thinking for all men. Kishi saw those vast iron lungs of dehumanized labor, measured and quantified with time and motion studies by Taylor and his efficiency experts. In Germany, another have-not, Kishi absorbed the concept of industrial rationalization, where the government sponsored cartels and trusts to organize various key industries. Kishi admired the system of National Socialism in Germany and despised the Americans for their individualism and free markets. Away from the proscenium, neon lights, window displays, down squalid alleys, behind torn rice paper doors, a solitary red lantern in the darkness might offer erotic, grotesque delights which rouse the senses of the most diseased sensualists. They established the Temporary Industrial Rationality Bureau, the state organ directly responsible for the administration of industry. Its duties were the implementation of scientific management principles, the improvement in industrial financing, standardization of products, simplification of processes, providing subsidies for domestic goods. The Bureau set about forming export and industrial unions for each industry, organizing each sector into cartels which self-regulated prices and production. Often, Kishi would visit cafes which offered organ service, where the waitress lay across your lap and sang varied notes as you touched different parts of her body. Sometimes, Kishi could not help himself and would sink his teeth deep in the nape of the neck of a young girl. Sliding aside the screen door of the geisha house, behind the kabukiza, Kishu's nostrils were stung by the odor of mutant flesh. An unspeakable formless meat pulp of hair, skin, and fat was propped up in a kimono. Kishi was on his knees, filled with repulsion and desire. As he undid his belt, the host whispered, "She comes from China."
In Kishi the Vampire, Royce Ing appears on stage in this Japanese propaganda kimono that you're looking at right now. There will be a chance in the performance that you see it, but we didn't in the clip. The kimono was produced in the 1930s in Japan. This is a better image of it, featuring on its backside the map of Japanese occupied Manchuria and Korea, and with a piece of newspaper clipping portraying the Mukden incident on September 18th, 1931. The sheer historical weight on such a rare and little-known historical artifact amounts to the unique performativity of Kishi the Vampire as a performative museum. Ing, as you saw, not a performer but rather a narrator, in the performance pieces together a compelling narrative through which historical facts of real and fictive personal accounts interweave. A grotesque animation on the backdrop illustrates with arresting details a series of architectural assemblages where spaces of brothels, cabins, offices, and industrial structures flow into each other, and where Kishi, the protagonist, moves through. So, thinking with Royce Ing, I will be talking about mainly the issue of nationalism in the case of Manchukuo, capitalistic system or a mutation of capitalistic system in that moment in the 20th century, and desire as manifested in a particular hentai aesthetics, which is the Japanese word for perversion or perverted desire, that you see in the visuals of the piece, which also I argue is a result of this capitalistic mutation. To start with Manchukuo in the context of nationalism, East Asia in the first couple of decades in the 20th century was brimming with discourse of modernization, various strands of nationalism, anti-imperialism, and republicanism. The case of Manchukuo affords a lens of understanding the East Asian modern, as Pransenjit Juara's seminal study on Manchukuo reveals. The state-building project of Manchukuo and its quest for national identity was born of the post-World War I international order as the institutional consequence of imperial nationalism in an emergent post-colonial time of mobilization and identity politics. It was a time when nationalism and national identity served not exclusively the will of the people under the principle of self-determination, but was more used as a leverage of imperialist enterprises of developed states, mostly European nation states, and in this case, Japan. So we're aware of the principle of self-determination that was popularized by US President Wilson. But that principle was accommodated when it served the interest, and it bent when it did not. So think of the case of Poland, or in the Near East, the British and French mandate zones of Iraq, Palestine, and Lebanon, and Jordan. Under this light of national self-determination, it is possible to understand the Japanese effort of narrating a continuous history of one nomadic and later semi-nomadic people under different names, with a history going back to the 2nd century before the Common Era, to which the Manchurians are attributed to. Durella also sharply observes that by comparison, at the same time, the Chinese historians, such as Gu Jiegang, did not appeal to, or not yet were conscious enough to appeal to, a deep history ethnographic testifying that Manchuria had always been Chinese. So here, deep history is used in a rather dubious tone. Instead, the Chinese contemporary historical account emphasized practical facts that there are over 30 million Chinese people, immigrants living and working in Manchuria at the time, and that they have a right to continue to do so as a principle of asserting the Chinese reign of Manchuria. At the same time, Japan profiled Manchukuo as a nation based on the alliance of 5 ethnic peoples. Very nice stamp that I've been recently acquiring through eBay, where you see the women of Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Manchu, and Mongolian ethnicities are seen living harmoniously together. And also, this is a series of stamps commemorating. It writes on the first one. It writes relinquishment, commemorating the relinquishment of extraterritorial rights. Right. So there was a series of also diplomatic measures done to relinquish the extraterritorial rights of Japan, which it had acquired after China lost against Japan and Russia lost against Japan. And they symbolically gave it back to Manchukuo, because Manchukuo was recognized as a nation state and Japan were not the colonizer. For example, it tolerated different religious practices and, in fact, mobilized different religious leaders. They got Panchen Lama from Tibet to go to Manchuria, for example, as part of this package of multi- or polyethnic alliance. Yet most of the time, this alliance appeared more rhetoric, when the Japanese privilege could be seen from wage to access to goods, and not to mention the wartime fascist mobilization of non-Japanese forced labor that we will hear about in a bit. I'll turn my attention to the Kyoto School for mapping a sort of philosophical underpinning of the whole Japanese World War II operation, and that, I think, in perfect dialogue with Pa Chen-kyung's work in the exhibition. The Kyoto School has been largely condemned for association with the idea of the Great East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, an economic, cultural, and political collective entity encompassing parts of Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, guided by Japan. They saw this as both and means, based on the prediction that the permanent solution to Japan's global vulnerability lay in the sustained improvement of its capacity to wage a protracted defense of its regional base in East Asia and the Western Pacific. The Kyoto School thinkers rejected actually implementing this idea through force, yet militant Japanese ultra-nationalists use it to their end and led Japan to wage wars. So, not taking a revisionist approach, I follow the study of Christopher Goto-Jones, who evaluates the validity of this idea of world historical standpoint developed by the Kyoto School as an attempt to transcend the question of national loyalties. En route, we see the world historical standpoint as presented by Keiji Nishitani as following the historical movement from the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, to arrive at the Pacific. And this is again an interesting image because in Park Chan-kyung's work, it's all about waterfall. And here, Keiji Nishitani writes, naturally, this does not mean that the Mediterranean and the Atlantic have lost their meaning, but only that the Pacific, which has not played a world historical role before, has graduated onto the stage of world history, which is to say that these three aforementioned oceans have now reached the point of communicating as though they were a single living creature. In other words, the world's major oceans have, in political terms, united to form a single ocean. Now, this is the Kyoto School's sort of problematic association with the war, but we should not discredit that they also have contributed to philosophy as a discipline. So their distinctive contribution to philosophy that some of the Kyoto School thinkers have made is on this idea of absolute nothingness as a concept that is not secondary to being, but as a primary term or primary form of being, which is inspired both by the Buddhist concept of sunyata, which means emptiness, and Western philosophy, most notably Heidegger and Nietzsche. Variably defined, the fundamental emptiness lies underneath everything and favors an ontology based on negation, and we will probably return to this in a bit. And the aspect that Royce Ng deals with in this lecture performance is the story of Manchukuo's industrialization. And we see it under Kishi Nobusuke Kishi, who was the vice minister of, the deputy chief of the Office of Administrative Affairs in Manchukuo from 1936 to 1939. He was a strong believer in state-led industrial capitalism and used Manchukuo as his test ground and organized its economy with guided investment plans, utilizing forced labor and funds from drug industry. And under his reign, the big conglomerates such as Nissan made profits by following exactly the government guidance to invest in key sectors in Manchuria. This is largely drawing on Mark Driscoll's study, where we see Kishi was notorious for his racialization of the Chinese as inhuman and, in effect, treating them as low-cost or unremunerated labor to the point of dehumanization. And having observed, this is the bit that you saw in the clip, having observed industrial organization in Western countries, Kishi admired American Taylorist labor management, economic planning, and industrial rationalization, and Germany's adaptation of technologists, engineers, together with business management and planning. Combining all of these methods and with the Soviet-style 5-year plan, Kishi's industrial rationalization kick-started the Manchurian industrialization. And this came down well with the Japanese ultranationalists in the army who had legalized the possibility of overtaking Japan's economy in the case of war, and they were exactly on way of implementing this. For them, economic planning was explicitly war as a continuation of business by other means. Now, Kishi's plan was so successful that well into the time of post-war and communist China, for decades, this whole region of northeast China accounted for about 90% of the whole GDP of China. And the historical significance of Manchukuo did not stop when it dissolved. After the war, Kishi was imprisoned as a Class A war crime suspect, but was never indicted, for he was believed to be capable of steering the country in a pro-American direction. He made his political comeback and became prime minister in 1957. And his post-war vision for Japan followed the same logic of state-led capitalistic economy to make the country's economy strong again and ultimately to seek rearmament for Japan to achieve the independence from America's influence which, as some of you are aware, that his grandson, Shinzo Abe, the current Prime Minister of Japan, is committed to. The Japanese military dictator Park Chung-hee, who has been mentioned multiple times, was trained also in the Japanese military. Did I say Japanese? No, the Korean dictator Park Chung-hee was trained in Japanese military academy in Manchukuo in Changchun. He befriended Kishi in the post-war period and normalized the relation between Korea and Japan, through which Korea received aids, loans, and commercial credits from Japan to kickstart its economic rebuild. And this, again, explains the friendship between Shinzo Abe and the recently impeached Korean president, Park Geun-hye. And I think in a way that resonates very well with Yong-woo's talk just now, we see the implication of Kishi's policy in office during and after Manchukuo, attesting to this underlying political landscape of East Asia. The death of Manchukuo was the birth of East Asia. And that we see this mechanism that Duara puts us. While imperialism was certainly preserved in this hegemony, it also dictated relations between center and periphery different from those of the old colonies. The new program involved more alliance, autonomy, investment, development, identity, and competitiveness. In many ways, Manchukuo prefigured the phenomena of a junior partner or a client state dominated by hegemonic states such as the United States and the Soviet Union in the post-war period. And this is a similar mechanism, I think, when Yong-woo wonderfully analyzed the case of the relation between Korea and Vietnam and North Korea, for example. Now I'm going to turn to a different set of topics, the desiring production, which connects to the aesthetics that you see from the piece. The rapid development of Manchukuo and its deep-reaching aftermath makes a compact case study of capitalism, desire, and power. In Deleuze and Guattali's philosophy of history, which I think is popularly quoted in the exhibition, there is a primary flow of desire that submerges everything and that gets mitigated through the different historical stages. Whereas pre-capitalist societies code desire through inscription, the capitalistic machine frees the decoded flow of desire. Inscription entails making bodies so to create representations of things and to attribute meanings, and this in turn represses the flow and the flux of desire. So in the very primary society, desire is socialized by coding and inscription. And in the next stage, which comes after the primary society, it's the despotic regime that comes to impose a new alliance system and places the despot himself in direct affiliation with the deity. And this despotic state dreads the flow of production and exchange and tries to rule by tightening control. Yet what will overcome all of these societies is a structure that is known as the capitalistic machine, which captures the flow of desire by making them a structural part of its own operation. That is, through the appropriation of production altogether. Capital begets capital, bypassing the production of commodities altogether. So we're getting a very compact history of capitalism. And working by conjunction to decoded flows of desire and to deterritorialize labor as it does, you may ask, how does the capitalistic machine still need the state? The role of the state is not to be underestimated because the state widens the limits of the capitalistic economy, especially within an order of military expenditures. So Manchukuo's control of the slaves and the forced labor and its citizens, all of this may suggest that it pertains to the order of the despot, yet as the economic policy of extracting infinite surplus through perpetuating production, and that, I think very importantly, production becomes an end and no longer the means of capitalism, falls closely in line with the capitalistic machine. Now, why this analysis of philosophy of history is important is that it manifests itself in this desire, right? So I'll have the video running in the background so that you will have more of an bombardment of this sensorium, hentai aesthetics in the sensorium, and well, I will be continue speaking about this aesthetics. So while the narrative makes a compelling revisit to a particular chapter in history, the aesthetics that Royce Ng adopts, inspired by the erotic, grotesque culture of Japan, and especially its visual manifestations from the early 20th century, marks an equally important pathway to understanding the Manchukuo complex. There is such an idea as hentai perversion, which pretty much became evident in interwar Japan, which showed a connection of capitalism and this erotic culture that erodes nerves and infiltrates into the human sensorium. Fetishism around female bodies, coupled with desires exemplified by the novels of Edogawa Rampo, which are all filled with psychotics, perverts, vampires, sadomasochists. These prevailed the urban culture of interwar Tokyo. Sociologist Akagami Yoshitsuke has already theorized in the 1930s what he called the immediate society, which is when human desiring production in the neuropolitical mode of fascination and enthralled stupefaction is sold to worker-consumer for the wage substitutes of pleasure which now comes with ideological instructions on how to be an obedient purchaser in this new regime. Now, this acute analysis of desiring production that substitutes the authentic, unalienated modes of desire herits what would come to be known as affect economy decades later. I'm sure that you smart people out there are aware of this phenomena that this production of desire, the circuit from affect to emotion is attached to a circulation of images meant to stimulate desire already satisfied and demand already met, as capital extracts value from affect around consumer confidence, political fears, everything that no longer that collapses the distinction between production and consumption. Medical studies of the time of interwar Japan also suggested that the erotic drives expressed in hentai, including sadism, masochism, and fetishism, are but products of modern civilization and capitalistic material culture, so much so that the Japanese sexologist Tanaka Kogai called it the height of hypocrisy for modern states to attempt to repress that which their advanced capitalism constantly stimulates, new affects and new pleasures. The spearhead around Japanese Psychiatrist Association held the view that humans express aspects of hentai because Japanese and global capitalistic society were themselves fundamentally hentai. Consequently, they recast crime as multi-causal relative to the metropolitan environment that it is embedded in. They even normalized and depathologized split personality disorder as simply multi-personality. Now, this line of argument brilliantly anticipated Deleuze and Guattari's study of the close relation between capitalism and schizophrenia in their Anti-Oedipus. So the two identify that the social and political repression permeated by desire results in schizophrenic, neurotic, or perverted behaviors, effectively linking psychic repression with social repression. The cure then is in a strong resonance with Tanaka Daike's earlier, is that rather an affair of desiring production, of getting it going, and giving it somewhere to go, other than into the void. So they famously said a shizo out for a walk is better than a patient in a psychiatrist couch. This theorization of erotics, that's another line of thought. The theorization and erotics and the normalization of borderline fetish behaviors were coextensive to the wars and violence, both sexual and in general, in the time of Japanese imperial expansion, which returns to the metropolis capital of Tokyo in the form of grotesque visual cultures, right? So there's one continuation of colonial domination violence that's committed on the bodies of the other peoples that returns in the form of hentai in the home domestic context of Japan. And it is in this light that we can understand the title of this lecture performance, Kishi the Vampire, as Kishi was known as the Showa era monster, but vampire is an extension of this monster or a specification of this monster that also pertains to this idea that the vampire figure as expressing a capitalistic desire. So also in the words of Deleuze and Guattari, capital is dead labor that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks. Now, it's important to note for me that this likening of Kishi to the vampire and the latter itself as a creature gone awry in the schizo-capitalistic order is not at all to exonerate Kishi from his willful decisions, nor is the comparison of Japanese war machine to the conjunctive operations of desire in the capitalistic stage a way to play down the horror of militancy. It is rather a set of historical moment. It is rather to set the historical moment in a frame that implicates man and material flow through the lens of desiring production. Now, to come back to the Kyoto school, what we've seen earlier is Manchukuo as a case in point reflecting the operation of desiring machine on different levels. In the social economic aspect, it herits the advanced capitalistic stage where production is for the sake of production, and even war as an expanded means of production. And in the counterproductive aspect, the sort of nomadic moment, which entails the opium trade, is also absorbed to reinforce the state. And on the necropolitical level of the body, desire embodied by the shizo manifests itself as perversion, resulting in the erotic, grotesque visual culture of hentai. To grapple with the desire and time and shifts in power is exactly what the Kyoto School thinkers set out to do. And in this regard, we are trying to look at their philosophy beyond the immediate implications of this, the political connotations. The call to negation in the thinking of Nishida marks the fundamental theory that underneath everything is nothingness, as we've alluded upon earlier. And this emptying out of the self as a theoretical frame and meditational practice is not coincidental in the face of a world disrupted by war. Yet the thinking of nothingness goes further. Nishida models the world in such a way that there is not an individual that has the experience, but that there is an experience that has the individual. So methodologically, instead of establishing a continuum beyond subject and object from the inside out, Nishida recasts his method, moving from the outside in. And he hence adopts terms like pure experience to talk about this anonymous, impersonal quality of experience. And this is really where I made a connection to Yu's passage and the passing. And of course, your movement is the inside out and extending to the cosmos, whereas Nishida's method could be viewed as reverting the movement. And this is also very important for making a bridge between philosophy, qua pure metaphysics, and philosophy of politics or political philosophy. I like to point out that even though these are sort of very recent studies that I have carried out, and this is a field that's rather under studied by far, Nishida did express that the emptiness of the subject becomes a way for him of entering the world history and of overcoming modernity. And he didn't quite elaborate on what he meant by that. And here I'm looking at recent studies of David Williams, who points out the Confucian connection of Kyoto School, especially the political scientific aspect of Confucianism in the Kyoto School. So the Kyoto School thinkers have variably drawn on Confucian ideas of Tianmen or Tianming in Chinese, or the mandate of heaven, to characterize a regime whose rule is legitimized by destiny, moral authority, practical effectiveness, and raw power. Further, they have illustrated a regional leadership by consent, which entails that the elites should inspire, lead, support, and listen if the requisite measure of public cooperation and economic effectiveness at the level of the individual members of the society was to be attained. And this connects to, I think, a rich body of scholarship on this sort of idea of resonance between the individual and the society at large that is evident in Confucian political philosophy through various times in history. And I won't mention the very, very antique ones, but even up until mid-19th century, when China was already on the brink of collapsing, there were scholars, Confucian scholars, believing that you could achieve a man-cosmos alignment, and you can access this alignment and hence radiate the sort of righteousness throughout the entire nation or the entire empire. Right, so this idea that ritual and self-cultivation can have a direct influence over the whole body of the nation is quite naive, but that they were very serious about this, and they vigorously compelled local gazetteer. They reconstructed shrines to commemorate people of virtue, all in the strong belief that this would enhance or rectify the qi of the whole nation. And this is where I made this it's a bit of a far-stretched thought, but this is where I made the connection to Elisée Reclus, the French anarchist philosopher who thought of the Silk Road at about the turn of the century, 19th and 20th century, as a slow Silk Road, as a marker of the human's collective consciousness to become one with the body of the earth. Right, so I'm a little bit paraphrasing him, but the idea is that yes, you are part of this man-earth immanence, and that you can, through your own effort, connect to this immanence. And these are all, and he's not the only anarchist geographer, by the way. There's another, the Russian Peter Kropotkin, better known as an anarchist than a geographer, but who also worked in Siberia and proposed the movement of the plates of the continent Eurasia as moving in a particular direction. So he was also theorizing essentially the movement of geoplates and and later social movements. So these, for me, are no longer quite coincidental. And these are all diverse ways of articulating this resonance and these movements larger than what's given in the present, and attempts of recuperating what's beyond the immediate by acting in the present, at times falling back into an earlier, perhaps rightly idealized model, at times resorting to an absolute negation, and at times from inside out, at times from outside in. As such, it provides a counter-image to the schizo in the wish to rectify the desiring production that is out of control. Perhaps what amounts to the biggest difference in these two images is the idea of order, and if the immanent order as found in the man-world-heaven alignment could be restored through ritual and practical efforts at all. Perhaps following the Deleuzian model, the transition from pre-capitalistic despotic machine to the capitalistic machine has cast an irrevocable different condition for the order of the previous kind to be maintained. With the materialist history in view, Deleuze hence asks, how does one come to desire strength while also desiring one's own impotence? It remains to be seen how traditional-backed ideas of coexistence and governments could contribute to our contemporary time of ever-expanding desire. So I guess this question goes back to Hui's consideration, the question that he ended on. So to conclude, thinking along with Royce Ing's Kishi the Vampire, I have illustrated a history of Manchukuo with key agents in its political and in its politics and economics and beyond, as well as a conceptual history surrounding Manchukuo and East Asia. The moments depicted in Ing's performance opens a case study not just for models of governance and economy, but also for the movement of mutating desire, from the desire kept at bay in a Confucian or pre-capitalistic order to the desire of self-perpetuating capitalism. While not exonerating economics and military horror, locating desire in war, violence, and crime is immediately against the grain of moralist historiography. Yet, as the intellectual history coextensive to Manchukuo evinces, There are philosophical discussions on being and negation, desire and the individual, governance and coexistence beyond the political level that are worth revisiting. Not least because some of these topics are regaining traction in the long aftermath of the 20th century. So, thank you.